My name is Nadia Voss, and I am 36 years old. There are moments in your life that arrive quietly. No warning, no dramatic music, no slow motion. Just a single ordinary second that splits everything cleanly into before and after. Mine happened on a Tuesday morning in a probate courtroom in Chicago, where I sat in a steel gray blazer with my hands folded on the table in front of me, completely still, while my father stood up and told a judge that I was a drug addict who had manipulated a dying woman out of her life savings. He said it with his chest puffed, with his voice filling the room the way it had always filled every room I'd ever been in with him. He said it like he believed it. He said it like he had been rehearsing it. And I sat there, and I let him talk. Because I had learned a very long time ago that the most powerful thing a woman can do in a room full of people who underestimate her is to let them finish. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for the women who got buried by the people who were supposed to protect them, and who dug their way out anyway, one document at a time. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end where my family planned it to. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to understand what happened 12 years before it. When I was 24, my father found a prescription bottle in my bathroom during a visit I hadn't asked for. It was from the emergency room. I'd gone in 6 weeks earlier for chest pain and exhaustion that turned out to be a combination of severe anxiety and working 70-hour weeks at a firm that treated junior analysts like furniture. The prescription was for a 10-day course of medication, standard, unremarkable, already finished. I'd left the empty bottle on the counter because I hadn't gotten around to throwing it away. My father picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and made a decision about who I was that he would not revise for the next 12 years. He called my mother from my own kitchen and told her I was in trouble. He called my sister Petra before he even left my apartment. By the time I realized what was happening, the story had already been drafted and distributed. Nadia had a problem. Nadia was struggling. Nadia needed to be handled carefully, which, in my family's language, meant kept at arm's length, talked around, and brought up in lowered voices at holiday dinners as a cautionary tale about the dangers of city living and too much ambition. When I tried to explain, he cut me off. He said he knew what he'd seen. He said the discharge papers I tried to show him were probably falsified. And when I pressed harder, he took those papers from my hands and burned them. Actually burned them in my own kitchen sink while I stood there watching, because he wanted to make sure I couldn't use them to contradict the version of events he'd already decided to believe. He threw me out of the family financial support system the same week, not with a conversation, with a phone call informing me that the custodial college fund my grandmother had set up for me, money she had put away across 15 years of careful saving, had been reallocated for family needs. I found out later what that meant. It meant my sister Petra's wedding at a venue that cost more than most people make in a year. It meant keeping my brother-in-law Derek's failing business venture alive for another 18 months before it collapsed anyway. It meant a membership to a country club my father had wanted to join for years and could never otherwise afford. My grandmother's money. My future. Gone. I want to be honest with you about what the years that followed actually looked like, because I think there's a version of this story that skips past the hard part, and the hard part is the only part that explains everything else. I slept in a 24-hour library for 11 days at one point. I ate whatever I could afford, which was sometimes very little. I took jobs I was completely overqualified for and did them without complaining, because complaining required energy I didn't have. I cried in bathroom stalls and on night buses and in the back corners of coffee shops that let you sit for hours if you kept buying refills. And through all of it, there was one person who never stopped calling. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss, had been watching everything from a very quiet distance. She had asked questions my father didn't realize she was asking. She had hired someone to look into things he assumed nobody was looking into. By the time she reached out to me directly, a letter, handwritten, slipped into a birthday card my family assumed she'd stopped sending. She had already put together most of the picture. She knew about the custodial account, she knew where the money had gone, and she knew that the story my father had been telling about me was something he had constructed, not something he had witnessed. Eleanor didn't make a scene about it. That wasn't how she operated. What she did instead was methodical and quiet and, I came to understand, deeply intentional. She paid for my certification exams. She covered my master's program when I was accepted and had no way to pay for it. She wired money with notes that simply said, "For whatever you need," and asked nothing in return except that I keep going. I kept going. Over the next 7 years, I built a career in financial forensics. Specifically, I joined the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division of a federal regulatory agency, where I spent my days doing one thing I had become genuinely exceptional at: following money until it told me the truth. Eleanor died in March at 81 in her own house, in her own bed, exactly the way she had lived, on her own terms. Her will left 80% of her estate to me. It named me executor. It locked my father and Petra out of any primary inheritance entirely, with a small secondary bequest that came with specific conditions they would need to meet to access it. She had written it carefully, with full legal counsel, and updated it twice in the 5 years before she died. Both times with witnesses, both times with documentation of her full mental clarity, because Eleanor had known, with the precise intuition of someone who had watched this family operate for 8 decades, that they would challenge it. She had left me a letter, sealed, to be opened at the courthouse if it came to that. She wrote at the bottom, "They will make noise. Let them. The paperwork will outlast all of it." My father filed the challenge within 2 weeks of the reading. He and Derek retained a lawyer who specialized, apparently, in the specific art of making people look unstable on paper. And what they produced, what they walked into that Chicago courtroom with, projected on monitors for the judge and everyone in the gallery to see, was a set of medical records from a facility called Hartwell Recovery Institute. 30-day inpatient treatment, severe dependency, psychiatric holds, my name, my date of birth, my signature on intake paperwork. Documents I had never seen before in my life because I had never been to Hartwell Recovery Institute, because Hartwell Recovery Institute did not exist. I knew that the moment I saw the employer identification number in the bottom corner of the billing header. I recognized the format. I had seen that particular document structure before. Not at Hartwell, but in the financial records of a collapsed hedge fund case I had worked 18 months earlier. I knew what a shell company's paper trail looked like from the inside. And what I was looking at, projected in high resolution on the courtroom monitors while my father pounded the table and my sister pressed a dry tissue to the corner of her eye, was Derek's work. The same entity structure he had used to route investor money through fictitious vendors in a fund that was currently under federal investigation for securities fraud. He had handed me the evidence. He had walked it into a courtroom, had it stamped by a clerk, and entered it into the official record. He had done my job for me. My attorney glanced at me, visibly pale. I put my hand briefly on his arm and told him quietly that I needed 10 minutes. He looked uncertain. I told him more quietly that I was a federal forensic investigator and that I needed 10 minutes. I stepped out of the courtroom, made 2 phone calls, and came back. My father was still talking when I returned. He was telling the judge about my years of instability, about Eleanor's vulnerability, about how Petra had been the one who visited consistently, who cared for her in her final years. All of it delivered in the confident tone of a man who had never been meaningfully challenged in a room in his life. Judge Caroline Merritt had been listening with the particular stillness of someone who has heard a great deal and is waiting to hear something true. She was in her early 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. She had been reading the submitted documents carefully throughout my father's presentation. She stopped at a specific page, tapped something near the bottom with one finger, and looked over the top of her glasses. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice entirely level, "before we continue, can you tell me what your daughter does professionally?" My father smiled the way he always smiled when he thought he already knew the answer to something. He told the court I worked in government. Something low-level, he implied. Something clerical. The kind of job a person ends up in when they couldn't make it anywhere better. He said it with the specific dismissiveness he had been deploying in my direction for over a decade. Judge Merritt looked at me. "Ms. Voss, would you like to clarify?" I stood up. I told the court, clearly and without any particular drama, that I was a senior financial forensic investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division, that my work involved identifying, documenting, and referring for prosecution complex financial fraud schemes, including fraudulent document networks and shell company structures. I told them I had worked the case that connected to the specific employer identification number printed on the Hartwell Recovery Institute records currently in evidence. I told them that Hartwell Recovery Institute was not a medical facility. It was a paper entity incorporated 22 months ago in Delaware, currently listed as a subsidiary of a holding company whose primary officer was my brother-in-law, Derek. I put the documentation on the table. Derek's face drained of color in a way I will not pretend I didn't find deeply satisfying. I wasn't finished. I walked Judge Merritt through the financial records I had brought, the bank transfers my father had made from Eleanor's custodial account for my education fund 12 years earlier, the wire records to the wedding venue, to the bridal salon, to the country club membership, the loan transfer to Derek's fund, structured to look like a personal gift and documented nowhere in my father's disclosed finances. I laid it all out, one page at a time, in the same methodical sequence I used in every case I'd ever built, because that's what it was. A case. I had been building it for years without letting anyone know that's what I was doing. My father stopped talking somewhere in the middle of the bank records. I noticed because the room got quieter and the quality of the silence changed. Petra started crying, not the performed dabbing from earlier, real crying, the kind that happens when a person realizes the version of events they have built their life around has just been publicly, permanently revised. When the federal agents I had called during my 10-minute recess appeared at the back of the courtroom, Derek stood up from his chair as if he might say something. Then he sat back down. Whatever he was going to say, he apparently thought better of it. Judge Merritt revoked the challenge. She referred the fabricated Hartwell records to the U.S. Attorney's Office. She froze all accounts connected to Derek's fund pending the active federal investigation and appointed an independent administrator to oversee the estate transition. She did all of this in the same level, unhurried voice, as if none of it was particularly surprising, which I suspect it wasn't, for a judge who had been watching family fraud cases in Cook County for 20 years. Before I left the stand, I asked to read Eleanor's letter into the record. Judge Merritt granted it. Eleanor had written it in her own voice, the same voice that had sent birthday cards with handwritten notes even when the rest of the family had long since switched to texts. She wrote about what she had observed in her family over 81 years. She wrote about what she had done to make things right and why she had made the choices she had made in her will. And she ended with one line she had underlined twice, in the deliberate way she did everything. A woman who survives quietly is not a woman who has given up. She is a woman who is waiting for the right room. I folded the letter. I walked out of that courtroom. The wind off Lake Michigan hit me the moment the doors opened, sharp and cold enough to make my eyes water, and I stood on the courthouse steps for a long moment just letting it. My father had spent 12 years telling anyone who would listen that I was broken. He had spent 12 years believing that the daughter he threw out at 24 was the cautionary tale, the footnote, the one who hadn't made it. He had never once updated that file, because updating it would have required him to acknowledge that he had built it on something false to begin with. I had let him believe what he believed. I had let the story sit. I had kept my name off the noise and my energy on the work, year after year, in quiet rooms with government laptops and financial records that most people would find impossibly dull, because I had understood, somewhere in those 11 days in a library, that the truth is not loud. The truth is patient. The truth keeps its receipts. Eleanor had called me a woman who survives quietly. She was right. And the room, when it finally arrived, was exactly the right one. If you've ever had someone in your life decide who you were before you had a chance to become it, and if you kept going anyway, quietly in whatever room you had access to, this story is yours. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you stayed here until the very last word, you already know what to do.